Presentation of dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho.
Coming up, they're one of the most iconic species of the American West, bighorn sheep. But their numbers are declining due in part to disease carried by domestic sheep. Bighorn advocates say the two groups should be completely separated on public land, but sheep operators say plans to do that will decimate their industry. We'll talk about it next on Dialogue. Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Marcia Franklin. There are some wild animals that just seem to provoke more passion than others.
One is the bighorn sheep, whose majesty has inspired humans for thousands of years. When Lewis and Clark made their westward trek in the 1800s, as many as 2 million bighorn roamed North America. Today, there are as few as 30,000, with 2,000 to 3,000 in Idaho. That's about half of what existed in the 1990s, in part because of die-offs due to pneumonia. Research shows the disease is transmitted to bighorns from domestic sheep grazing on the same public lands, although visual evidence of contact is difficult to come by. After an environmental impact study, in 2010, the Payette National Forest in Idaho decided to restrict domestic sheep grazing by almost 70,000 acres. That plan has gone into effect, and 9,500 head of sheep have been removed from the forest. 2 more phases still need to be implemented. But the sheep industry is fighting back, worried that the decision will set a precedent across the country. It wants a 5-year timeout while more research is done on a vaccine. U.S. Representative Mike Simpson is sponsoring the measure.
It doesn't overturn the decision that was made on the Payette Forest. Some people think it does. It doesn't reverse that decision. That still stays in place. What we're essentially saying is don't use that decision to then make planning in other forests around the country. Give us a chance to work on this vaccine that is being produced. That the people working on it have great hopes for it, and hopefully, like I say, this will put pressure on both sides to come to the table and start talking about some reasonable alternatives that will actually work, that will protect bighorns. Nobody wants to protect bighorns more than I do, but I also don't want to destroy the domestic sheep industry.
So is it sheep versus sheep, or can the two coexist? With me to discuss the issue and take your questions are 4 guests. In our Moscow studio is McCoy Oatman, the chairman of the Natural Resources Subcommittee for the Nez Perce Tribe and a former chairman of the tribe. Welcome.
Thank you.
And here in Boise, I'm joined by Suzanne Rainville, the former supervisor of the Payette National Forest, Margaret Solon Hinson, the president of the American Sheep Industry Association, and Neil Faggard, the former president of the Idaho Wild Sheep Foundation, now with the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. Welcome to you all.
Thank you, Marcia. Thank you.
Now, do you have a question or comment about this issue? Give us a call toll-free at 1-800-973-9800. First, before we begin, I want to show people what we're talking about. We've got a map that shows where the Payette National Forest is in relation to Idaho. You can see it right there, kind of on the border with Oregon and a little bit near McCall. And then let's take a look at what we're talking about in terms of the sheep and goat allocation. This is how it started. This is how it was, rather. And then phase 1 of the Payette plan, I think, restricts it more than that. And then phase 2, it looks like the graphics are not quite right there. They're not quite going away. Maybe we can draw those up in a moment. But anyway, it takes about 9,500 head off immediately. And then the total number is what more, Margaret, like?
More about 13,000 head of sheep would be removed from the Payette National Forest.
Total. Now, let's talk first about this timeout. The process had been finished. The plan, as we talked about, phased out a certain amount of grazing. And now, as Representative Simpson has talked about, he wants to attach a rider to the appropriations bill for the Department of Interior that would take a 5-year timeout. Margaret, I'll start with you. From the sheep industry's perspective, why is a timeout needed from this process that was quite complex and is already finished?
Well, Marcia, what we're talking about is a timeout for the rest of the national forests. For our industry, there's about 23 million acres of bighorn sheep habitat on the National Forest System lands. Of that, 1 million acres has domestic sheep grazing on that, 23 million acres. But that's almost 1/4 of the domestic sheep production here in this country.
And I believe we've got some shots of your actual bands, your sheep, so we can show that while you're talking. So talk about the impact then.
So we're looking at losing almost 1/4 of the domestic sheep production in this country. Think what that does to the infrastructure behind our industry, because it's not just a few sheep producers that are impacted. It would be the packers, the processors, the feeders, the woolen mills, and we produce a tremendous amount of raw materials that provide for economic growth and jobs in the economy. So from our perspective as national industry, we need 5 years to figure out the research.
Even though there was quite an amount of time that went into developing this plan, years, I think something like 7 maybe?
Well, yes, but as Representative Simpson said, we're not talking about rolling back the Payette decision. We're talking about that decision being expanded across other national forests, which we know that there have been pressure from certain groups to do that.
Neil Faggard, former president of the Idaho Wild Sheep Foundation, what's your sense of what a timeout would or would not do for this situation?
Thank you, Marcia. Our thoughts on the timeout is that bighorn sheep don't have time. There wasn't a timeout on the Titanic. We've got bighorn sheep that are on the downslide, and we need to act. It's critical right now for the sake of bighorn sheep. And Margaret alluded to the economics of the domestic sheep industry. Wild sheep and wildlife in this country are a pretty big business as well, and we want to ensure that not only are these populations viable, but that they become sustainable.
So let's go talk to McCoy Oatman from the Nez Perce tribe. McCoy, talk a little bit about why the tribe, which is further north than the Payette, got involved in this issue. What do the bighorn sheep mean for the tribe?
Thank you, Marcia. Well, the Nez Perce tribe, as maybe some of you may know, in 1855 signed a treaty with the United States government. And under that treaty, we ceded large tracts of land to the United States government. And these sheep reside within those 1855 boundaries. And so the tribe has a relationship since time immemorial. It dates back to, where I come from. I'm a 7th generation descendant of old Chief Looking Glass, who signed the treaty and who himself utilized bighorn sheep. As the picture depicts there, in his hand he holds a bighorn sheep bow. The shirt that he has on is made from bighorn sheep, and we use both of these items as trade resources, but also we utilized every aspect of the animal for tools and clothing. And so it just shows the cultural ties that we had to this animal. And right now, we're not able to go out there because there's not healthy harvestable levels. We want to be able to go out there, have those healthy numbers so we can take our kids out there in future generations so that they can utilize this resource and know the significance that the animal has to them and to their lives.
So very briefly, what is the tribe's position on taking a 5-year timeout to do some more research, maybe find a vaccine and figure out what's going on between domestic and bighorn sheep?
Well, it's like Neil said, we needed separation yesterday, and the tribe has maintained a policy of working through a science-based process, which happened through the Payette National Forest, and we feel strongly about that process, and we don't feel that management decisions should be made through legislation. And by taking this time out, it further jeopardizes the bighorn sheep. And as your opening piece stated, it shows that the populations are in a rapid decline, and we need to take those measures now to turn that trend around.
Suzanne Rainville, you were the supervisor of the Payette when this plan came out. You're now retired. In your comments for the plan, you said, "I'm sure my decision will not satisfy everyone." Now, I know you can't comment directly to Representative Simpson's proposal to take a timeout, but certainly a lot of work went into this, did it not? And how would you characterize how difficult it was to come up with the decision?
Well, we started in 2005 on the forest, starting the analysis process, and it was very rigorous. And in the end, we had excellent data, good science, and a lot of help from the public in terms of indicating to us what their thoughts were in terms of...
Was it 26,000 comments?
26,000 comments by the time we were done. And the difficulty is that from my perspective, from the decision that I needed to make, I needed to provide habitat for viable populations of bighorn sheep, but I also wanted to make sure that I maintained some domestic sheep grazing on the forest where it was appropriate and where the risk was low. I think that, you know, the bottom line, what we learned through this whole thing is that we need to keep the two species separate and reduce that risk of contact, however that's done, and that's the decision I had to make on where that was appropriate on the landscape on the Payette.
So you feel confident with your decision, probably in your view no timeout needed? Or you feel confident that your decision was the right decision?
Yeah, I think our decision was a good decision. I tried to balance all the different comments that we got and our responsibility to provide that habitat for bighorn sheep.
It's a big managing act that a supervisor
Correct.
has to
Right.
manage all these multiple uses. Before we go to the phone calls, let's talk a little bit about the larger issue, the transmission. I think there's some disagreement, some agreement, some disagreement on what we're talking about. Why don't you tell viewers what your views are on what is happening between the two species?
Yeah, when bighorns are forced to share their range with domestic sheep, there's a high probability that bighorn sheep will become sick. They get they contract upper respiratory bacterium from domestic sheep, and I'm not going to get into the flavors of bacterium, but there's numerous ones, and it causes severe problems for bighorn sheep, for wild sheep. They cannot survive and sustain by sharing their range with domestic sheep.
And the transmission, we see some research shots happening. There's been many samples collected of what you're talking about, this pneumonia. The transmission happens when they touch noses, or how does that happen, that a bighorn would come in contact with a domestic sheep?
Well, and contact is not very clear at this point. But research shows that when they're in proximity, could be mere feet, could be nose-to-nose contact, as you've stated there, Marcia, and so contact can be very difficult to determine, but it also creates difficulty in identifying what separation is. Separation is also a difficult thing to...
So the end result is, and I think we have some footage of this, that the animals start coughing.
That's correct.
And then waste away?
Yes, they become pneumonic, and at that point it's very contagious and runs through the herd and causes low lamb survival and can cause all-age massive die-offs.
Marcia, I might interject just a little bit, and I think this is where Neil and I do have a little bit of a disagreement in regards to some of the things that we're finding out with the research, which is critically important, is what does determine contact and how does that transmission happen? And we do know that it takes direct nose-to-nose contact, and for a little bit of period of time. They have done experiments where bighorns and domestic sheep were penned 30 feet apart for a period of, I want to say, 60 to 90 days, and there was no transmission. Now, I would not argue that transmission cannot happen. I think we know transmission can happen, but under what circumstances? And I would say that that's a real variable that we don't understand all those parameters, but we do know it takes direct nose-to-nose contact and mucosal exchange. So, you know, defining those type of things are really critical.
And
yes, sorry. In Margaret may be correct. I mean, there's still some debate on this. The bottom line is bighorn sheep cannot share their range with domestic sheep. You know, whether it's nose-to-nose contact, whether it's mere yards where the transmission occurs, the risk is there. If domestic sheep are within that occupied or suitable bighorn sheep habitat, the risk is there.
Marcia, I would like to just throw out a few figures because I think this is really important to understand what we're talking about here. So I talked about the 23 million acres of bighorn habitat across the national forests, and 1 million of those acres have domestic sheep grazing on them. For here in Idaho, we have close to 22 million acres of Forest Service lands. There's about 5.3 million acres of bighorn habitat in those Forest Service lands. And of that bighorn habitat on Forest Service lands, there's only about 138,000 acres that have domestic sheep grazing on it. So we're talking about 2% of the bighorn habitat in Idaho has domestic sheep grazing on it, and 98% of it does not.
I'll let you respond.
So,
we've got to get to some phone calls, though.
Okay, okay. The separation and the habitat in Idaho is very contiguous. Large tracts of bighorn sheep habitat. The bighorns have declined. As the bighorns, if the vector is removed from the habitats, the bighorns will start to recover. As they start to recover, they are going to utilize their suitable historic bighorn sheep habitat.
We've got some calls holding. Let's take a call from Jonathan in Boise. Jonathan, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I've got two really quick questions. One is I've heard that there are very few ranchers that would actually be impacted by this decision, and I'm curious to know exactly how many ranchers would be impacted by this. And then the second question is I'm curious to know how many sheep the Wool Growers Association think is appropriate that we might see die while they're working on a vaccine that could take many, many years to find.
Okay, thank you very much. How many sheep operators on the Payette? This decision affected, I believe, 4.
Correct.
Right?
On the Payette, there were 4 sheep producers. But like I said, this isn't just a decision about Idaho. It's a decision across the national forest and across the West. And it is about 25% of our domestic sheep production in this country would be impacted. So that's a huge, huge number.
And again, his question was how many sheep that you feel could be...
I'll be honest with you, I don't want to see any bighorns die. I don't think there's a sheep producer out there that wants to see bighorns die. But I do think that through the research that we will actually be able to improve the bighorn health in the overall. And I think that's critical because we know we have die-offs in bighorn populations where there is no contact with domestic sheep. And so working together and solving that issue is really, it's the right way to go about it.
Quick question for you, Ms.
Marcia,
Rainville.
can I interject?
Go on, McCoy.
Okay, I just wanted to make a statement on the last part. You kind of briefly talked about vaccines, and I actually had a visit with my staff today, and they had been corresponding with WSU, and one of the statements that they had let us know, the people that are working on the vaccine, is that, you know, with all things falling into place, it would be 10 to 15 years before they could come up with a vaccine. And I don't think the burden of vaccination should fall on the bighorn sheep. I think that burden should fall on the industry. And I think, you know, that's a much more controlled population where you could actually have a better chance of administering those vaccinations.
Yeah, and I would agree, McCoy. I think it is much easier to administer a vaccine to a domestic sheep, and not necessarily. I think the interesting thing is that even a year ago, people were saying that bighorns could not develop an immune response. We have been able to show this is how much progress we're making with research, and rapid progress in my view, because we're finally asking the right question. We're finally asking the question of how do we keep bighorns alive rather than how do we kill bighorns. And that's a big difference. So we've been able to show that bighorns can develop an immunity. We also are working towards, are there methods, are there ways that we can vaccinate domestic sheep to prevent them from shedding? So, you know, there's lots of opportunity out there. We can't be too narrow in our focus.
Do you see your decision as having ramifications for the entire forest system that has domestic and bighorn on it?
Yeah, you know what we've been talking about in terms of the pay-it decision, it did set up an analysis that can be used nationwide, particularly in the West. And so the federal agency, the Forest Service, has a responsibility to provide habitat for bighorn sheep. And so it's that overlapping habitat where you have domestic sheep and bighorns that really is troublesome. But the Forest Service still has that responsibility to determine what habitat they have, how are the bighorn sheep using it, how are the domestic using it, how far are the rams moving across. The Forest Service has to do that. We don't have that. We don't have the option not to do some analysis, and the analysis the pay-it did is being applied in the West.
Let's take a call from David in Boise. David, go ahead, please.
Yeah, the question I have is that first I appreciate the efforts of all of the interested parties coming together, and Idaho has tremendously diverse lands, and the question I have is how does the tables of the party feel that the policedness in Idaho has inhibited the really safe production of domestic sheep and the protection of wild sheep in Idaho?
You cut out. Political what?
The political divisiveness.
Divisiveness, okay. Thank you very much. How much does politics enter this equation?
I think it enters at a great deal, and unfortunately it does. Unfortunately for the domestic sheep industry, unfortunately for wild sheep. You know, the Payette National Forest made the best decision based on the best science that they had. And now we've got legislation that is being proposed that is jumping in and possibly hindering the potential alternatives for the domestic sheep industry and the recovery of bighorn sheep.
Could we see potential Endangered Species Act? I mean, they're already a sensitive species, right, bighorn? So
That's
could we
right.
see an ESA situation here where somebody comes in to try and designate?
Well, I personally, I think with the trend that Idaho's bighorn sheep are taking, the next net that we fall through is U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services managing bighorn sheep in Idaho.
We do have some email questions that came in, or comments and questions. On this political angle, Catherine writes in, how much vaccine research money has been contributed by each side to the issue? Do you know how much the sheep industry has contributed to vaccine research?
No, they have contributed money, and I don't have the exact figure.
Okay.
One of the big things that we were able to work through, though, was getting the Agricultural Research Service, the Animal Disease Research Unit involved, and so that we are bringing additional expertise to address that issue.
The sportsman's dollars have been spent at Washington State University on this domestic bighorn sheep research. It is now approaching $2 million.
And several people wrote in and wanted to know how much in contributions has each side contributed to political delegates in their campaigns. That's a large...
We've contributed zero.
Okay, and the Nez Perce tribe, I assume you contribute money to various politicians involved in this issue. I think that the tenor of the question is that people feel like politics has inserted itself into a scientific process, if I can summarize some of the emails that I've gotten.
I think I look at this
Yeah,
as...
Marcia.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, McCoy.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to interject on that. You know, the one piece that I wanted to comment on is that the tribe was working on a collaborative process, and each of those times, those kind of did fall to the wayside because of the political aspect on the state level and also on the national level, where you see legislation at the state level to, you know, where they come up with management practices for separation. And also, as you see on Simpson's bill now, you know, it's a very politically charged issue.
Yeah. I can speak to that because McCoy, it was the Nez Perce tribe, it was the American Sheep Industry and Wild Sheep Foundation. Neil can speak to that very much as well, who we met for a period of, was it 3 years? 2 to 3 years. I think it was 3 years trying to find some collaborative solutions. And my view of this, of collaboration is this. I mean, collaboration tends to be the venue of last resort. So people will always, I mean, that's just human nature. They will seek all other venues until they've exhausted those. So in my view, the time is ripe again now. And I think that's what Congressman Simpson is doing. He's actually creating that space that we need to have to really bring people together.
I mean, you know,
people hadn't exhausted all the venues before, and I can't blame them. I mean, the domestic sheep industry was very much guilty in regards to that, but
because the sheep industry went to the Idaho State Legislature and got a bill passed that prevented some of this.
But I would say that the sheep industry is having a very difficult time believing that this type of, that these actions can actually be putting people out of business, that this is what can happen. And you know, I hate to bring up the famous 1997 letter, but you know, they felt like they really had a guarantee.
This is a letter, and we are running out of time, but this is a letter where the various agencies and wild sheep advocates, when Bighorn were reintroduced, and I believe we've got some footage of that, when they were reintroduced, there was a statement made that we will not hold domestic sheep operators liable for any disease transmission.
Right.
That letter violates the tenor of NEPA, and so, but it is, there is a lawsuit about it. Some other sheep operators feeling like they were led down the wrong path, so to speak.
Correct.
Yes, and to that letter, you know, it is a letter. It was referred to as an agreement at one time, but it was merely a letter, and the rest of America did not have the opportunity to speak up on the issue.
We're going to continue this conversation on the web because it's just too big to do in a program, but I want to ask what's next. And I want to ask McCoy, now the tribe, does the tribe, you have about a minute to speak to this, but does the tribe have any options here in terms of your rights and the federal government on this issue? What's next, do you think?
Well, I think you know, we're going to watch Simpson's bill closely, and I think that the tribe is going to continue to fight for the bighorn sheep. Bighorn sheep aren't able to speak for themselves, and it's our job as Nez Perce people to speak for those animals, and that's what we're going to do. We're not opposed to any type of collaboration. However, we're open-minded in that regards. We're not opposed to grazing. We're just pro bighorn sheep.
Well, great. Very complex issue, indicative of what federal land managers are having to deal with on a daily basis. Would you say this is one of the most difficult decisions you've ever had to make?
This was the most difficult decision that I ever had to make, and it was a very hard decision, but I still believe it was the best decision given all the information that I had in front of me.
All right, well, thank you very much. We've been talking about bighorn sheep issues, and we're going to continue this discussion online. You'll want to check our website out for that. I'm Marcia Franklin. Thanks for tuning in to Dialogue.
Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho. Check out our website, like us on Facebook, or follow us on Twitter.